Hello all, and thank you very much for having me here, and thank you also to my fellow presenters for being very kind. So my entire presentation is entitled The Eighth Amendment Referendum in Historical Perspective. So it's important, I think, to start off with what exactly the Eighth Amendment is, the exact wording, and when exactly this originates. So here we have it. Started in 1983, Article 40.3.3 was passed by a 2-to-1 majority in favour of adding this to the Irish Constitution. It states, quote, "The state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn and, with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws to defend and vindicate that right." Now that's quite wordy, as you can see, but essentially what this means and what it has meant up to this point is that it equates the right of life to the mother as the right to life of the unborn. Now, as we're all aware, this has had multiple implications in Irish healthcare and also in Irish society, but I think it's important to acknowledge the historical basis for this. While it clearly comes from 1983, this issue actually predates this quite significantly further, and I will track this back to the Irish Free State. So in 1937, the Constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, was finalised, and in that, Article 44 is quite an important article that foregrounds a lot of this. It notes that, firstly, the core unit of society is the family, and also it gives a special position to the Irish Catholic Church. Arguments that arose during the campaign for the Eighth Amendment in 2018 were reminiscent of disputes that actually arose during this time, in and around the 1930s and even predating this. In fact, the 20th century is an important time to look at the abortion rights campaigns because reproductive rights were not so much seen as an individual choice, but more as a eugenic imperative to be safeguarded by the community and also in legislation. Then, predating this, we have the 1929 Censorship of Publication Act, which prohibits material suggestive of or inciting to sexual immorality. Now, this is, again, quite vague, but what this essentially did was it banned mentions of contraception and abortion, including divorce, in Irish society. Again, this doesn't say a huge amount, but when you look at the actual debates surrounding this bill and debates surrounding the Constitution, we can really get to the heart of how eugenics informed the abortion debate. Deputy J.J. Byrne, in the second reading of the Censorship of Publications Bill in 1928, stated, quote, "To the vast majority of people, the limitation, control of births, or the infliction of race suicide upon this nation is one that is bitterly resented. Therefore, birth and reproduction are not seen as an individual concern, but more an issue of national significance that had to be controlled through legislation." In fact, Deputy Byrne goes so far as to state that any limitation on births, whether this be contraception or abortion, would be equivalent to race suicide. This, of course, term, race suicide, inherently focuses on the numbers of population, which was common at the time. Of course, there was a general concern following World War I about the decrease in population, so this was not unusual. However, this focus on numbers of population actually endured into 2018 during the current referendum debate. The Save the Eighth campaign spokesperson, Cora Sherlock, noted that 100,000 births had directly resulted from the introduction of the Eighth Amendment. While she doesn't state specifically a source for these numbers, it is clear that a numerical factor of population was core aspect of her debate rather than the medical care of this population or indeed their quality of life. However, this focus on population statistics again dates quite further back. At the moment, I'm tracing this back to the 1948 Emigration and Rural Depopulation Commission of Inquiry. This inquiry deemed it morally indefensible for married couples to remain childless, as, quote, "the primary purpose of marriage was the reproduction and children." Therefore, it's shown that the reproduction of the population and the increase in population numbers was not so much an issue of personal choice, but one that was of national significance. Eugenics and abortion, of course, have long been tied together. But this is particularly evident in 1929, when Joseph Canavan, who wrote an article entitled The Ethics of Medical Abortion, notes that abortion is not an easy question for medical practitioners and for the general public alike. However, he does note that in cases where the mother's life depends on it, he still urges doctors to refrain from engaging in this medical procedure. He states that, quote, "There is a higher good than medicine. It is not for a doctor to decide who lives and dies. This decision rests firmly with God." And therefore, you can see the influence of religion in this debate. He also makes the woman out to be the aggressor in cases of rape, stating that, quote, "The baby did not ask to be put there." While this seems like a rather backward idea to have, in fact, this sentiment is reflected in 2018, wherein the Bishop of Raphoe, Dr. McGuicken, reflects this, stating that, quote, "She might be pregnant as a result of rape. In such cases, recommending an abortion might seem like a gesture of compassion. But even in those tragic cases, the unborn deserves to be cherished." So you see quite the same sentiments being reflected. The Bishop of Cork, Dr. Buckley, his contemporary, wrote that human life may be rendered disposable should abortion be introduced in 2018. Bishop Cullinan, a fellow contemporary as well, noted that following the referendum, it signalled the introduction of eugenics into Ireland. He noted that, quote, "The majority of Irish people have thus accepted that some life is not worthy of life." This quote is particularly interesting given that I now work with a lot of German documents, because this quote, "life unworthy of life," is a direct translation from Nazi racial health laws, Lebensunwertes Leben. This health law essentially legislatively forced abortion, sterilization, and euthanasia for a certain amount of the population, thus leading to thousands of vulnerable people to be murdered. So I think it is no mistake that he uses such wording. However, it's important to note that this debate was not solely about medical ethics, about religion, or about legislation, but also the role symbolically that a woman plays in Irish society. In the Immigration and Rural Depopulation Commission of Inquiry, childbirth was considered to be a woman's primary function in society. They noted that it was the moral duty of women to become pregnant every 2 years in order to sustain the population. So again, you see a focus on numerical figures of population rather than any sort of quotient of their medical care. A more contemporary example, in Sambaraju et al.'s study on the Citizens' Assembly of 2016, highlighted the contemporary view of women in Irish society. They note that, quote, "Very few seemed to understand the complexity of life in general, thus deeming women in need of guidance for decisions about their own medical care." Anne Enright then noted that repealing the Eighth Amendment involved much more than legislative change, but also a fundamental change in how women are viewed in society. Enright notes how issues of selfhood were sacrificed with the introduction of the Eighth Amendment for the perceived role that women were to play in society. Medical consequences were thus obscured by their perceived role as mother. However, she does note that discussion of the Savita Halappanavar, Miss X and Miss Y cases helped to illustrate the medical need rather than their role in society. Back to the Irish Free State, Edward Cahill, who was a prominent contributor to the Irish Monthly, noted in his article, The Social Status of Women, that he considered women's virtue to be, quote, "the foundation of all social happiness and prosperity." So there you see again the tying of the role of women to essentially national prosperity. Dr. Rudolf Geiss, a contemporary of his, considered it to be a woman's responsibility to live up to a higher moral standard than men, which is quite interesting. He notes that, quote, "It is her fault if she steps down from the pedestal and cheapens herself, as to do so would jeopardize the highest good of the race." So again, you see a focus on racial characteristics and national improvement through a woman's decisions. It is evident, therefore, that a woman's chastity, morality, and devotion was considered to be indicative of social progress. Therefore, conversely, we can state that access to abortion and rising illegitimacy rates in the Irish Free State was considered to be an indication of societal downfall. Contemporary medical attitudes, of course, have always been at the forefront of the debate, both in the Irish Free State and in the current debate in 2018. However, this has a strange origin with actually the Vatican encyclical, the Casti Connubii, that was established in 1930. This officially banned abortion and contraception, as it noted that the primary purpose of marriage was reproduction. Even in cases where an abortion would save a mother's life, they were forbidden to provide one, stating that, quote, God would reward her sacrifice in heaven. While this does not seem to be directly relevant to medical care in Ireland, if you remember again the place that the Irish Catholic Church was put in the Constitution, you can see how this would have had a direct reflection on Irish medical care. This is especially seen in 1931, wherein a Catholic call for action was published by an anonymous author, noting that Catholic doctors actually should be informed about abortion and contraception. However, importantly, that their Catholic ethics should always supersede their medical ethics, thus putting them essentially in a double bind. The Irish Rosary in 1928, preceding this, sort of noted a much more emotive reason for not allowing abortion, stating that abortion and contraception were forms of, quote, Protestant materialism. Therefore, birth was framed as not solely a medical issue, but one that was a moral and religious duty, regardless of the medical consequences. The question of doctors has always been significant in the debate and was thus foregrounded in the 2018 referendum. The establishment of the Doctors for Choice group has dispersed medical knowledge about the topic as a necessary medical procedure. Dr. Mark Murphy, the spokesperson for Doctors for Choice, noted that the Eighth Amendment effectively prevented doctors from providing proper care to their patients. This, of course, was reflected by numerous other doctors, given that over 1,000 had formally declared their support by May 2018. The Minister for Health, of course, reassured that conscientious objection would be possible for doctors, given those who did not agree with these sentiments. Thus, we come to a conclusion that we're all very familiar with. On the 25th of May 2018, the referendum passed by a 66.4% majority. Both national and international newspapers covered this overwhelming yes result. However, I am going to look at what exactly these newspapers stated. The New York Times, for example, stated that, quote, this referendum signaled the end of an era, end quote. However, it's not specified exactly what this era is. It is clear from their debate, however, about a certain few aspects that signal what this era could be entailed as. One that involved considerable influence of the Catholic Church, not solely on religious matters, but also on religious, medical, and legislative matters too. In all of these newspaper articles, the influence of the Catholic Church and the dwindling mass attendance is referenced. They also note that it is no longer a black and white issue, but one that is much more nuanced in the minds of the public. However, it is notable that Bishop Cullinan urged people to go to confession simply for voting yes, despite the fact that 70% of his diocese, well above the average, had voted yes in the referendum. This shows how the stance of the church has not changed. However, those who follow the church have changed. Those who are religious seem to be more informed that while being Catholic, many do not necessarily follow the rules so closely. Savita, Miss X, and Miss Y led people to see the medical need to vote yes, even if they personally disagree with abortion. While this presentation cannot illustrate each side of the repeal argument in depth, it can illustrate the intricacies of the debate and its origin much earlier than 2018, going back to the Irish Free State. The issue of the abortion debate can be more fully understood through questions of morality, social status, eugenics, medical ethics, heredity, and the access to abortion services. The framing of moral choices and a woman's place in society was central to this, along with the control of the church over personal, legislative, and medical affairs. People in the Irish Free State did question a woman's ability to make such medical decisions without a guiding nationalist, pronatalist, and religious ideology behind them. As seen in Sambaraju et al.'s case study on the Citizens' Assembly, such doubts endure today. It remains to be seen, of course, how these historical debates will thus affect legislation and its implementation, but for now I will leave you with my sources, and thank you all for coming.